In the absence of a police force, the threat of death or mutilation was a clear way of preventing crime. But in later Anglo-Saxon times, it wasn't just punishment that was a deterrent. Even before you were found guilty, the trial itself could be an ordeal, literally. In common with much of Europe, the later Anglo-Saxons adopted an additional method of determining proof, one which drew on the power of the elements, of water and of fire, and which invited God himself to intervene in the trial. This was the Judicium Dei, the judgment of God, trial by ordeal. If you were suspected of a crime, you were subjected to a ritualized but painful and dangerous test. God would come to the aid of the innocent, but for the guilty, there would be no such comfort. The ordeal was neither torture nor punishment. It was a mode of proof. Only if you failed were you punished. Because of their religious element, ordeals were supervised by the clergy. Two main kinds of ordeal were employed in England. The first involved carrying a piece of red-hot iron in your bare hand. Before the ordeal, the priest called upon God to bless the hot iron, so that it would be a pleasing coolness to those who carry it with justice and fortitude, but a burning fire to the wicked. The accused had to walk a few paces, holding the iron. The hand was then bandaged, and after 3 days was inspected to see if it were healing. If the wound were clean, that was proof of your innocence. But if it had started to fester, you were deemed guilty. The second kind of ordeal was more dangerous. You were bound and lowered into a body of sanctified water, and your guilt was determined by whether you floated or sank. Now you might assume that sinking meant you were guilty. After all, you were much more likely to drown. But the belief was that the water was so pure as to repel sin. Sinking indicated innocence. Floating was proof of guilt. Ordeals like these may sound barbaric, but they were carried out in Christian Europe for centuries. I asked legal historian John Hudson what factors determined whether you were sent for ordeal in the first place.
They seem to have been often proposed as a way of settling cases that you couldn't settle in other ways. For example, if you don't have any factual proof, no marks on the person who's accused, no evidence that they're holding on to stolen goods, no blood on their hands, then there's a chance that no one will know who committed the offence, and then the likelihood is that they would have to go to trial by ordeal. The number of people who actually undergo the ordeal, having been threatened with it, may well be much smaller. It seems to be a way of trying to scare people either into confessing or very often into settling.
This was the judgment of God, so how often did God acquit in such circumstances?
We have quantitative evidence. We've got registers from the 13th century from Hungary which give us numbers of people going to ordeal, and we find that more than 50% of people get off.
Why might the acquittal rate have been so high?
Must be physiological in some way. And people have done studies of throwing people in swimming pools and seeing how many of them naturally float and how many of them naturally sink. And also, of course, carrying a hot iron should cauterize your hand. And what convicts you, it seems, in England, is not whether you are burnt or not, everyone will be burnt, it's whether your hand is clean or foul, i.e., has it turned pussy or not. So what really matters to you is whether you are bound up thereafter with good ointment and clean bandages.
While officially God was determining the outcome, it seems that human intervention was quite possible at all stages of the ordeal, and nobody had greater control over the process than the clergy. How often they might have given the Almighty a helping hand in declaring guilt or innocence, we'll never know. But it's clear that the whole ordeal system ensured for the Church a central role in the dispensing of justice.